Welcome to day 3 of UNHCR's annual consultation with NGOs. My name is Hiba Ali, and I'm the director of IRIN News, and I'll be your moderator this morning. I think I was particularly interested in this session, which, as you can see, is labeled Hard Talk with George Okoth-Obbo for a few reasons. First of all, the theme of this consultation is putting people first. We at IRIN really tried to do that with our work. For those of you who don't know, we're a news organization that specializes in covering humanitarian crises, and we see ourselves very much as amplifying the voices of those who are on the ground and helping policymakers understand their realities. But secondly, we recently spun off from the United Nations to become independent, and in so doing have been really focusing on trying to increase transparency and accountability in the humanitarian response sector. And so this format of Hard Talk is very welcome as far as I'm concerned, and I think a great model of having fora in which senior officials in the humanitarian sector can be publicly held to account and asked difficult questions. So George is a tough one to stump, but I will do my best to ask some difficult questions, and we will invite yours as well, of course. I will encourage you as much as possible to use Pigeonhole for the questions, and that's mostly so that we can try to batch them into thematic groups and keep a bit of a flow in the conversation. Just so that you are aware of what we're going to try to cover over the next hour and a half, so that you have a sense of when your questions might most be appropriate. We're going to look at high-profile operations, Myanmar, Syria. We're going to look at forgotten crises, Yemen, CAR, etc. We will look at emerging crises. We'll look at the rollout of the comprehensive refugee response framework, the role of governments in responses today, some of the commitments around localization, around cash programming, IDPs, which I know will be a focus of your discussions later, accountability, and the prioritization allocations process. So it's a lot of ground to cover. And I know a lot of these topics you've already discussed over the course of the last couple days. Today we'll really try to look at them through an operational lens and a much more kind of field-based approach. And I think in terms of introductions, that's more or less what I need to tell you. We will still take questions from the floor for those of you who aren't comfortable using Pigeonhole, but for those of you who are, I would encourage you to channel them that way, and it'll just help me keep the flow of the conversation. Lastly, I think just in terms of the importance of accountability and hard talk. We're talking about, of course, an organization, the UN Refugee Agency, that has more than 11,000 staff, a budget of $8 billion this year, working in 128 countries around the world. And so like everyone in any sector, I think this is a great forum to be able to see how that all works in practice, and give you an opportunity also to throw some questions at George. George, you all know, is the head of operations at UNHCR, but comes from a background of both legal, he's trained as a lawyer, but also protection, and has, as you know, had much experience in the field before moving into management here at UNHCR, including as the UNHCR representative in Kenya. He was head of the Division for Protection. He was head of the Regional Bureau for Africa. So comes at operations from a deep place of knowledge and experience. And is Ugandan national, as you also know, which also is quite interesting from a refugee perspective, given what's going on today in Uganda. So I will just jump right in, and I think start with the big high-profile crises of the day. I know you've talked about Myanmar a fair bit already, but I did want to start there because it is a crisis that perhaps reflects a lot of the challenges that the sector is facing in terms of refugee response today. And when the flow of, I mean, we've been covering Rohingya tensions for 10 years, so this isn't a new crisis per se, but of course has intensified in the last year. And when the flow of Rohingya refugees over the border into Bangladesh really started to increase last year, one humanitarian described it to me as the following: the system has not been so bad at responding since the response to Goma in 1994. You had UNHCR and IOM competing over who should be coordinating the response, a government that was, as many would describe it, quite politicized in its response, and in the meantime, a mess on the ground. So George, looking back, what would you, as UNHCR, have done differently in that operation in its early days?
Okay, good morning, Heba. Good morning to all of you, my dear friends. And I hope you don't mind if I extend a special good morning and happiness to the refugees themselves, especially young people in that context. And that's actually probably the answer to the very first question that has already rolled up in the pigeonhole, that there is indeed a true commitment, as is reflected by the presence here of the people that we serve themselves, to making people first, making refugees first. Indeed, as we go on, I will be very happy to hear myself from how they see an improvement in that engagement, not only in consulting refugees, which I think over the years we are improving in doing, but making them the agents of their own destiny, and to indeed even help in decision-making of the things that we do, including in operational terms. Because I am willing to acknowledge right now that when it comes to that spectrum of things, of what we all do, there we tend to be driven by the imperatives that we ourselves have to respond to operationally. And those then include a very big mix of things that do not always, in all cases, coincide with what the refugees themselves would have wished. Now, in regard to the question about Myanmar, what could have been done differently, let me just say two quick things. The first one is that Myanmar, in fact, represents a particular problematic that we face on the landscape of our humanitarian response, all of us. And it is really this. As you saw and you heard the High Commissioner say 2 days ago, as we sit here, one human being is being displaced every 2 seconds, 44,000 of them in the year, and 3 million between 1 year and the next. What this means is that while we have old situations that are not going away, whether it is in Yemen, whether it is in Algeria, the Sahrawi situation, whether it is in CAR, whether it is in Colombia, more and more are being added each year, and the system is at breaking point. The system is at the very limit of its carrying capacity. For me, if I was to choose one thing which all of us should finish this consultation and work on very strongly for the 12 months before we meet next, that one thing for me would be capacity, because we are really at the limit of the capacity. So in the case of Myanmar, at the beginning, there was hardly really any conversation in terms of doing something about it, about the factors which are causing people to be displaced in the pace at which they were. And if you look at all the other situations which, as we sit here, are growing at the same pace, take the Venezuela situation, for example, or which are continuing to escalate, take the South Sudan situation, whatever we are doing on the humanitarian side, more should be done on the prevention side, because the system, in my view, has reached the limit or is very close to reaching the limit of being able to absorb the situation. Finally then, some of things which we could have done differently, we are seeing their consequences today in terms of really the risks, I would even say, that particularly the operation in Bangladesh faces. And I just want to mention two of them. The first of those is a structural one. For those of you who have been to Bangladesh and to Cox's Bazar, where we have almost 1 million people in a very concentrated space, structurally this operation cannot continue like this. Right now, the greatest and most painful experience of that operation is the impact of the rains of the monsoons on the refugees in Cox's Bazar. And we will go through that one way or the other. But even assuming that we did not have the monsoons, because of this high concentration of people in very narrow spaces, we had then, we still have today, and we will continue to have after September, when hopefully we will survive the monsoons and the cyclones, we still have a very high risk of outbreaks of health contagions at any time. Because of this massive congestion, what you have had here these past 2 days about SGBV, for example, in that operation, those conditions are there. So if there is one thing that we could have done, we were not able to do it, and probably are still not able to do it, is to envisage a way of responding to that situation out of a camp context. And this is true for Myanmar, and it is true for many other situations where unless we unlock this encampment paradigm, then we are stuck in repeating these situations in cycles. And then the second and last thing that I'll mention is in Bangladesh, we were obliged to work with a terrible coordination mechanism, then and now. We have tried to do what we could do to mend this system, but it is still a problem to the point where I myself feel that we are not even fully accountable. I do not feel that we are truly accountable, for sure, in protection terms, but in other respects as well. This system that we are working with is not only not helping, it is actually continuing to inefficiencies. So there are two things I want to say about that to conclude. The first one is that in the same way as we have been talking the past 2 days here about a very strong and much stronger and newer and more creative forms of partnerships between us, UNHCR, and the NGO partners, there is an even bigger partnership that we need to reinvent and to recreate. It is the partnership with governments. The governments have to be in position, in leadership, and to do it the right way. And secondly, we now, as system agencies of the United Nations, if we are going to be faced with governments that are strong about their own political choices, and there are many of those, I think humanitarian work over many years has evolved in dealing with weak or non-existent governments. When we confront strong governments, we are a bit lost. But in that context, we need greater unity among ourselves as the United Nations agencies. Because quite frankly, in this particular context that you have asked me about, there were also considerable weaknesses on our side which allowed that situation to be exploited and to allow a situation which is unacceptable in terms of coordination to continue.
So you saved yourself at the end, because I was going to say, you know, in thinking about what went wrong in Myanmar, you talked about the lack of prevention or addressing the root causes of the displacement. You talked about the lack of space. You talked about the government. And really the question is, what did UNHCR do wrong or could have done better at in terms of what it controls and its relationship with IOM in particular, that you think, you know, looking back, we've learned some lessons about. I think you've just touched on it now in terms of, I assume what you mean is that relationship with IOM.
That's correct.
Right. And so what will change in the future in that regard?
I think we have to make two simultaneous movements between ourselves and IOM in particular, but I think it is true for all other organizations. The first of the movements that we have to make is to find a more uniting narrative, because we can see that there are two compacts which are developing, the Global Compact on Refugees and the Global Compact on Migration. I think the future is that with these two regimes sitting side by side with each other, we will both take forward the objectives that are represented in those two different regimes in the best way possible by finding more common language, more common concepts that allow us to act more in unison and in the same direction than if we are perceived as being in competition with each other, or that we are each trying to preside over two subjects which are contradictory of each other. Because what that will magnify, it will not create, but what it will magnify is the opportunity for one to be played off against the other. And the second thing is that we have, both of us on both sides, we have to have really an unbreakable commitment that whatever we do does not weaken the other accountability, if you see what I mean. That, for example, if we are faced with a government which is forcing upon us a mechanism of work which potentially impairs the other, which potentially does harm to the other, particularly protection, because what was at the root of this in this particular case was, are these people going to be formally recognized as refugees or not? And this is so critical. Can you imagine if you are a Rohingya and you have just survived a form of brutalization in which your identity has been denied to you, and you have somehow made it across those horrible situations with also on the pictures on the TVs, and then you end in what is a place of safety, and the first thing that you cannot count on is identity. You could not possibly think of something worse. So in this case, for me, it is so critical that whatever we do in the way in which we deliver our responsibilities and are accountable to what we do, that we do not do harm to another public good. And protection is probably the highest and greatest of the public goods that one could think of.
So speaking of protection, and I see your questions, and I am going to get to them throughout the conversation. So if there are any specifically about some of the high-profile emergencies, please shoot them, and the rest I will get to throughout the conversation. Speaking of protection, one of the biggest protection failures, I think, would be Syria. And from a refugee lens, and because we'll come to IDPs in a minute, but if you put aside the protection failures within Syria and look at more widely the refugee response and what we now have, which is millions of people around the region who don't really know what their future is going to look like, resettlement levels that are relatively low, the Syrian refugee integration crisis, if I can put it that way, in Europe. I mean, how do you see what happens next in terms of the Syrian displacement crisis?
Yeah. So I think that it is important to have the glass is half full perspective on the Syria and many of these other, particularly the bigger situations. And what do I mean by that? Across all these situations, Syrian, Venezuelan, South Sudanese, etc., there are many, many, many problems. And many problems, as you said, which perhaps represent weakness of performance, weakness of, for instance, resources, etc. But it is important to underscore that essentially people have asylum, people continue to receive protection, and that we should deepen that, and we should continue to work on not only stronger protection, but the opportunity for people to become like our friends here, to have the opportunity in life, to have greater participation in society, and to see how all of us can work together, how we can innovate new forms of partnership. I hope we can get to speak to that as well. That having been said, it is also true that we are seeing some of the most serious forms of retrenchment from good asylum protection-based policy. Policies of compassion, policies of receiving people, either in deliberate policy and legal terms or in practice. So let me explain what I mean by this second thing. You know, in the global south at large, in Asia, in the Middle East, in Africa, refugees are still being admitted into asylum and they are being allowed to stay. So as you have heard our High Commissioner underline, Bangladesh is another example. In a very short period of time, that country received nearly 1 million people. So we appreciate this very much. This is an example that should be mirrored, that should be strengthened everywhere else. However, in these cases, if we look at asylum, not just as a physical place in which someone is, but as life, and the fullness of life and the completeness of life, to be able to secure education for refugees. In the Africa operations, for example, today for all new refugee situations, such as South Sudan, for example, and even enduring ones such as Mali, we are having only 11% of the children in school. And if you go to some of these, what schools are, really they are heart-wrenching. So there is a problem of asylum and protection being pulled back in terms of laws and policies, but there is also asylum and protection and solutions being pulled back in terms of conditions of life. And looked at from that point of view, especially in most of the global south, the conditions of life of refugees really are terrible. And in fact are weakening with time as we move forward. Our budget today, we are at about $8 billion. That is a massive growth in our budget. But although by volume we are getting more resources, on a per capita basis, we are becoming poorer. When I became director of the Africa Bureau in 2009, my replacement is in the room. He's Mr. Tabsova, whom you all know. But when I became director of the Africa Bureau in 2009, the global budget, the global income for Africa operations was around $660 million. When I left that position 4.5 years later, the income had grown to $1.1 billion, right? So you would say that, we got more money for refugees. No, the opposite is the case, because in 2009, with a budget of $660 million, the per capita expenditure per refugee was something like $1.24, i.e., to each refugee, we were spending $1.24 per day. By the time I left, when the income had doubled, however, the expenditure per refugee had dropped to about 60 cents. So this is the reality that we face, that on a per capita basis, our programs are becoming poorer.
I suppose you might say that's part of the reason that the quality of services might be affected, and one of the questions here is around the number of refugee strikes that we're seeing over quality of services, and what UNHCR can do to prevent this from escalating in camps and settlements. Apart from the financial constraints, what's going wrong in terms of the quality of the service that UNHCR is delivering?
Yeah, but let me just stay a little bit with the way this question here has been framed. Of all the operations in which basic services are at the heart of the operations, at the heart of what we do, basic services, including food and nutrition, including health services, and so on and so forth, the greatest of those are in the Africa operations. So if we stay with food right now, we have a crisis of food and nutrition, not only in new and fresh emergencies, such as is happening right now as we talk in the refugees who are coming from Cameroon into Nigeria, for example, but even in old refugee operations. Today, the single, in my view, most forgotten refugee situation that we are responsible for, perhaps apart from the Sahrawi refugees, would be the refugees from CAR, particularly those who are in Cameroon. Now, these refugees are in two waves, a group that first came in 1982, and more recently, the new influx that started in March 2013, when Seleka took over power in Bangui. If you look at the condition of these refugees in terms of food and nutrition, it's like even those refugees that came in 1982 just arrived yesterday. So the point to make about this, as we strengthen our response work in terms of inclusivity, in terms of placing refugees in national development plans, in terms of having development programs such as you all had here when my colleague Danielle was providing the update on the CRRF. That is all very important and should go ahead. However, at the same time, in order to avoid these types of strikes that we see, those of you who have followed the news, for example, maybe the director of the Africa Bureau would have talked about it. Just recently, we had refugees take over our office in Lubumbashi in the DRC, and it was around things like this. In order to avoid this, we must ensure that not only are the bigger, longer-term needs met, but the immediate needs are met on a durable basis.
Right, but
yes.
how is that not happening?
I think a lot of it has to do with resources, quite frankly.
But we always hear this as the response: we don't have enough money, we don't have enough money. With the money you have, what could be done better to avoid the problems around quality of service?
Let's work better, I guess. But I just want to come back to the resource thing, because it's a very real thing. And I stay with food. In most of these operations that I've been talking about, we are somewhere between 50 and 70% of food and nutrition availability. There is no other way of solving that problem than solving it as a resource issue to make sure that people have the essential resources to survive. So in all the things that the refugees accuse us of, I can make the commitment that A, we recognize that those are real issues and we would work at them, and especially those which are within our control. And I'm just repeating what our colleagues, my colleagues have said here ahead of me, particularly my counterpart, the Assistant High Commissioner for Protection, because I attended his session. Outreach to refugees, make sure that we not only hear them, but we listen to them, be much more transparent about the issues and the problems that we have. So if there are no resettlement places, let us be very honest and frank about that. So that I can repeat exactly as the High Commissioner and my colleague has repeated. But there is really a lot that we need also to depend on others. I have mentioned resourcing. Now, if you just allow me, I would like to add to that, unless you want me to wait and talk about how our partnership can help with that if we do it just a little bit differently.
With what?
With our NGO partners.
How it can help with the quality of services?
These kinds of issues, but
Let's
more
hear it.
broadly. Okay, what I want to say is the following. Is historically our partnership has been built on contractual operationality. If you look at the history of our organization, for a long time, and I will have to admit that some of that continues really, frankly, to exist, the partnership is really built around a contract that we have signed to deliver services. And therefore, we tend to spend a lot of our time in contractual performance, if you see what I mean. So it says in the agreement we have signed on page 3 that you will deliver this, so it is 2 days later, you haven't delivered that, you know, why isn't that happening? And to be absolutely frank about this, this can be a tense relationship as well. In my view, we need a more complex partnership on 2 grounds. The first of those grounds is that not only are governments redesigning policies and laws in the ways that we have talked about for the last 2 days, some of which really are not friendly to refugee protection. However, communities are also changing. Populations are also changing. And they're changing in ways which elevate their own interests and expectations. Well, we are suffering it the same way, why not help us? But quite frankly, some populations are also negative towards foreigners in general, refugees in particular, and things like that. So it seems to me that we need a partnership that engages with this turnaround that we must have in hearts and souls, in attitudes. If we are really going to insert refugees so that they participate more equally with nationals in the social and economic space, that is really not easy. And I know, for instance, in places where land is still an issue, to take that example, it is very, very controversial. Now the refugees are taking our land, and so forth. So we need somehow to have a partnership which, over and above the kinds of operational delivery issues that you asked me about in the context of the Bangladesh chapter of the Myanmar situation, to have this partnership which is much more dynamic in reaching out to decision makers, to political constituencies at home, everywhere, from the United States to my own country, Uganda, to everywhere. We need to have that. And the reason why I think this is very important, because this kind of work we are not very good at as UNHCR. We have, certainly my generation in UNHCR has been socialized in ways in which we have capability to speak to government officials, right? In that kind of, but when it comes to this reaching out on the ground with communities on a long-term basis in both rural settings, but it is even more complex in urban settings, I think we need a way of working and a relationship, which I think we are only now just starting to make, and in some instances we haven't even made it at all.
So you've talked about communities and governments. I want to zero in on governments for a minute because there's a question about it on Pigeonhole, but I think also a wider context, which is that increasingly we're seeing strong governments who want to lead refugee responses themselves. We see that in Turkey. We see, as you said, similar dynamics of strong, perhaps not very sympathetic governments in the United States, in Somalia, and in many places where Ethiopia, where governments want to take the lead and may not always have the same principles as you as UNHCR. And yet we're in a context in which we're pushing for locally led responses, for the international community to be playing a facilitation role rather than a delivery role. A geopolitical atmosphere in which there is less support for multilateralism and more support for bilateral action. I was in Yemen this week, actually, and there we saw really the Saudi government playing the dominant role, and in many cases not the international community. And so the question here is, how can NGO partners help in repositioning the UNHCR relationship with the government, and what do you need from them in what you've just referred to in changing the way you work? And then I suppose I would add to that, how do you, as UNHCR, then ensure that humanitarian principles are maintained when it's the government that's in the lead of the response? What then, you know, how do you ensure that your objectives for refugee treatment and protection are protected?
Okay, so let me lead into it with this, the last part of your question. Everywhere we work, governments will engage with us on refugee and other issues, for instance, where there are IDPs, returnees, statelessness issues, and so forth. Governments will engage with us, I think, with two objectives in mind. The first one is that many governments truly seek to abide by their obligations in refugee law, in statelessness law, in IDP law, to serve people in terms of protection, assistance, and solutions. However, most governments as well have other interests which might not coincide with those objectives. So it's a very tense relationship. And we are an intergovernmental organization which must remain constantly sensitive to our ability to do business. In other words, we have to be on the ground to be able to work on a day-to-day basis. And this means that one of the most complex areas of our work is when it comes to engaging with governments on difficult questions. Right now, as we talk here, Nigerian refugees are being refueled from Cameroon in fairly large numbers. I was there last week, and in that very week, 105 refugees in one incident. Valenta, that's correct, right? Yes, 105 refugees were returned in one incident alone. The voice with which we can take action and I'm not just talking of only protesting, but take action by voice, can be very limited in these cases. So I want to single out this particular case and ask our NGO partners who are here, how, in answer to this question, how can we collaborate much more in the voice around protection in the national context? Because I believe myself that NGO partners, I was in Bangladesh a few days ago, I think BRAC is here. Quite frankly, I think that BRAC has, at least on some issues, more leverage with the government than we do. Am I not right? Yeah. So how do we optimize this power that the NGO community has? And how do we optimize it? And let me now turn to the advocacy NGOs. And if the group from the United States doesn't mind, let me cite that group. How do we optimize this power of voice so that most of the energy is spent in the right direction? Because quite a lot of the energy we spend dueling with each other. Rightly so, but a lot of our energy is spent dueling on with each other.
You mean UNHCR and the NGOs?
And the NGOs, yes. How do we collectivize this so as to move in the right direction?
And what's your answer to that?
Well, I mean, I honestly would want that we maximize it. I feel that sometimes there is not sufficient transparency. I am sure some of the NGOs will say on our side too, but I have definitely seen it in cases where we can be joined in an enterprise together of research, of writing up the positions that these NGOs are rightly preparing in terms of advocacy. And then it may come out as fundamentally a battle between NGOs and UNHCR. And I can be very honest and say that what this then creates in-house is a dynamic of sort of feeling defensive, which is wasted energy, isn't it? So if there is a way, and that's where I want to take this point, if there is a way we can maximize our collective voice, our collective energies towards common action, and I'm talking now particularly operationally, and if BRAC doesn't mind, I'll cite the example from the Bangladesh operation, in which one of the best examples that I have seen there in operational terms between us and partners around preparing for and responding to the monsoons. I think that is an example where we're really acting in tandem with each other at all levels, in the engagement with the government, in the engagement with the communities, etc., etc. But the point I'm getting at is that the answer to this question here cannot be anymore, whether we are talking protection, whether we are talking assistance, whether we are talking solutions, cannot be anymore UNHCR will be the voice and then our partners will wait to follow operationally. I think we have to create a more equal relationship.
That means UNHCR being willing to take a back seat, is it?
We think we do, but let me hear from the partners themselves when we get to that exchange.
Well, I'd be happy to hear it. Does anyone have an example of where the NGO tried or was in a better position to be the one, for example, engaging with government and didn't have that space because UNHCR was too much in front? Not to put words in your mouths, but I would be curious as to whether the intention that the Assistant High Commissioner has just described is actually a reality in practice. So there's a hand in the very back there.
Good morning. I believe NGOs are part of civil society. And civil society is the voice of the less privileged, the vulnerable, including refugees and other persons of concern. They should be able to take that role to advocate on behalf of refugees to government. I believe NGOs can play a good role, depending also on the type of government, because most of governments, especially my previous government in the Gambia, back in the Gambia, see civil society as opposition, as sympathizers to opposition parties and so forth. But with adequate democracy in certain countries, I think civil society can play a role, including, of course, NGOs and UNHCR NGO partners. Thank you.
Okay, well, that's pretty positive. No one crying of negative experiences. So we're hearing on the record that UNHCR is willing to step back and let you lead, so that's good news. I want to turn to the CRF now because it does address, I think, some of the questions around the quality of services and the quality of the response in refugee contexts. So of course, this comprehensive refugee response framework aiming to provide or set up a system by which refugee responses are more sustainable, more long-term, more focused on self-resilience, but also where the so-called burden is shared among a wider number of players. There's been a lot of discussion already at this forum about the CRF, but I think what we'd like to talk about with you, and there's a question also about this from the floor, is how that's being rolled out in practice. And in Uganda, which was one of the testing grounds for this new approach, and where in many ways, you know, the conditions were ideal for this kind of approach to be rolled out, even there, it struggled to get off the ground, with Uganda warning that it wasn't getting enough support to be able to respond to refugees, even the traditional way, let alone in this more interesting and expansive way. What lessons have you learned from the Uganda experience about how you roll out or operationalize this refugee framework? And as this question points out, how are those lessons being applied now when you've got new crises emerging, Myanmar, Venezuela, South Sudan? Is that framework actually shaping your response in these emerging crises?
Yeah, okay. Let me try and concentrate on the operational dimensions of this question because in the update that Daniel provided here the day before yesterday, he provided an overall or state of play of where we are on the CRF. Now, those of you who will be familiar with the actual text of the CRF will know that a very strong part of it is directed to large-scale new onset emergencies, such as Uganda faced from 2013 with the arrival of what is now a total of over 1 million South Sudanese refugees. So what has the CRF done there, which demonstrates that it is truly a new facility that we should all embrace? I would like to highlight maybe at least 2 or 3 aspects. The first of those is that the CRF seeks that from the very inception of a response to an emergency, that elements that already look towards the medium to the long term, if refugees will remain in the country for long, are already inbuilt at that stage. That has been done in the case of Uganda for both the new emergency situations that started in 2013 and are continuing to this day, and are and those which pre-existed before. Because if you know about that operation, I concentrate on it because you have asked me relative to Uganda, that it is basically a settlement-based approach rather than a camp-based approach, whose objective is that within a very short time, there is actually a target that has been put on it of about 6 months. Refugees should basically be able to take care of themselves, at least as far as food and nutrition is concerned. That is having its many different challenges, the biggest of them being that as numbers have grown, it has put stress on especially this crop production part of the self-sufficiency strategy. But the concept was the right one. And I think this has to be magnified elsewhere. So when I cited the Rohingya emergency in Bangladesh, that is an example of another situation that has occurred in exactly this same time since the CRF was adopted, but where we have so far not seen this this shift.
And why?
It's because it is just coming on now.
But I mean, that's always going to be the case, where
yes.
You've got a sudden emergency, and unless from the start of that emergency you're doing things differently, you end up in the same situation.
No, this is true. I'm just saying that's just the way it happened. And I think for some of the reasons you heard me mention earlier on, i.e. a government policy and outlook which was different in terms of how people would be received and characterized. But what I'm saying now is that the CRF approach in the case of Bangladesh is bringing the same approach on board. If we go back to Uganda, there is a second thing that I would like to mention. As you heard Volker explain here yesterday, the Global Compact on Refugees will formalize a solidarity platform for every country, for every operation which faces an emergency on the scale that Uganda has faced, is continuing to face, Bangladesh, etc., etc. This was demonstrated in the case of Uganda in that in June last year, the precursor of that concept of the solidarity platform by way of a solidarity conference took place in Uganda in June of last year and mobilized for that operation far more money than we have ever mobilized through our own regular channels, at least in terms of contributions. So this, for me, demonstrates that this notion of solidarity was an important one to craft in the way in which it has been crafted in the Global Compact and represents an important way in which the benefits and effects of the CRF are going to be demonstrated in the future for countries which face the kinds of onsets that we have seen right now.
But can we be more tangible about that? So if we take Venezuela as an example, what is different about the response in Venezuela or around Venezuela as a result of the CRF at a very operational level?
And again, I think this has been discussed in the particular sessions. Maybe if I could pick one. You know, in the Latin America situation, we have countries that have formalized refugee systems and others in which national non-refugee systems are the mainstay for receiving and assisting refugees. So let us take and that's what the CRF basically asks, that let us democratize, if you wish, refugee response across all systems and not just within the refugee system. So let us go to Ecuador, for example. In Ecuador, 83% of the children are in school, in primary education, without a single cent of cost to the refugee program. They have all been admitted into school and are receiving education equal to that which Ecuadorian nationals receive in national systems without a cost to the humanitarian system. The same is exactly the case in that same country for primary health care as well. Moreover, while today more than 2 million Venezuelans have left the country, more than 2 million Venezuelans have left the country, and we are on target to have 3 million of them by the end of the year, only 280,000 of them have sought asylum, i.e. are dealt with through the refugee system. However, in almost all the countries in the neighborhood, the Venezuelans have found one or another solution through different pathways. These are all the things that the CRF approach encourages. Let us maximize and exploit all other options, and it is working. It is true that it has to be supported, and I would not pretend that there are no problems, there are no difficulties with that, but I think those are the examples that we would cite now. But let me just go back to Uganda and finish with one more example, and that is the placement of refugee needs within national, social, economic, and other systems, i.e. basically in national development plans. As we know, that has happened. As we talk now, it is happening in another country that is not yet formally part of the CRF, for example, like Cameroon. We think these are good things, but if you just allow me just 1 minute, it is fair that I point to the risks to which we should be attentive. And those risks go back to what I mentioned earlier on, that as we make this movement of strengthening medium to long term, of placement of refugee needs in bigger frameworks, in national development frameworks, and so on and so forth, we should be attentive to the fact that basic core needs, basic survival needs and protection needs, their integrity also remains secured. Because we should not face a situation where the humanitarian system of response is weakened because now things are being taken up in national development plans, healthcare, for example. Yet that system will take a longer time to come on board so that we get to the situation where all the healthcare needs of refugees are dealt with only through national mechanisms, national systems, national appropriations from the capital as part of. That still is a gap which is visible in countries like Uganda, for example. So I think it is important that we be attentive to that.
So maybe just on that note, one quick thing, which is, you know, in all of this discussion around the humanitarian development nexus and collective outcomes and the emergency and longer-term development partners working more closely together, what are your biggest concerns about how that will actually play itself out? And you just talked about, you know, for example, the making sure that there's still that humanitarian space. But there's so much discussion about this and very little, at least to my mind, idea of what it actually looks like on the ground.
Yes.
And when it goes wrong on the ground or how it could go wrong on the ground. What are your concerns around how that looks?
I would frame my concerns in one sentence, which is to say that we are and will continue to be part of common collective outcomes, especially in the context of the SDGs, but we must remain differentiated, i.e. there are specific outcomes, there are specific actions, there are specific results that we must be able to secure for refugees, above all in protection, but it is the same chain through to solutions which will require specific actions under the refugee framework or by the refugee mandate, which sometimes could be lost in an approach of common outcomes.
And what's an example of that?
An example of this is where in working through the UNDAF system, which as you know is the mechanism that was devised before for the MDGs and is essentially the same mechanism which is now working for the SDGs, you have a situation where not only governments, but quite frankly part of the family says that, look, what we are doing here is development. And it is development for nationals. You guys, you UNHCR people, you are bringing problems with this protection and, you know, that's confusing matters. That is creating tensions between us and the government. So therefore, the framework, the logic of UN presence in our country will be only development seen as infrastructural, economic, market issues, and all these questions about protection, about due diligence around admission, allowing people in, freedom of movement, access to labor markets, those kinds of things are not part of what should be included in there. This is not just a theoretical risk. It is something that we have experienced actually, and it has taken a lot of
Where
work.
have you experienced that?
I won't give the examples if you allow me, but that has actually happened, and we see the let me turn it in more positive terms, the need to continue working on that, not only with governments, but also with partners within the UN system.
I want to turn to IDPs and, well, where I see, we've talked a bit about the quality of service delivery, and I think we've seen a lot of improvements over, well, since the humanitarian reforms of 2005 in terms of how assistance is provided. Where I think the humanitarian sector fails more often is on the protection side. And Jan Egeland will tell you this all the time, that you know, there's no good having well-fed dead people. And in a lot of the crises that we're looking at today, in Yemen, in Syria, in CAR, in DRC. In fact, it's the IDPs in the country that are least protected, and in fact, often UNHCR is not even able to reach them in the first place. So you're not even present on the ground at all. So I guess I'll come to IDPs in particular in a second, but before that, I mean, when you look at UNHCR's operations overall, what keeps you up at night the most? Where do you see yourself failing the most? Is it service delivery? Is it protection? Is it a specific crisis that you worry about the most?
All of the above. The single greatest failure of protection, that's our mandate, is if the people that we are entrusted to serve end up being exposed rather to risk. And the worst form, the most extreme and most unacceptable of those risks is where there is loss of life or great brutalization of personal safety and dignity. So I can tell you that over these past weeks, the single most preoccupying situation for me that has kept me awake, but I also have slept a lot, to be absolutely honest about it. But the single most preoccupying situation that has kept me awake is the Rohingya refugees in Bangladesh. Because they faced, since the 19th of April when the rains started to come down, still face today, and will continue to face through to September, the risk not just of harm, but potential death. If the monsoons and the cyclones were to come with the vigor that we have all feared. We calculated, as you know, that up to 200,000 of the Rohingya refugees would be put at risk. The monsoons have come, and let me again acknowledge particularly all those partners that are present here in that case, but also others. Yemen is another one I would mention, where we are still able to have some kind of outreach, but primarily really through NGO partners. But just to go back to the situation that has kept me particularly awake at night, is that especially with the work of the partners, and let me also acknowledge the government, that so far extreme risk has been fundamentally avoided in this emergency within an emergency in Bangladesh. But we are not out of the woods. We have to wait and see if we continue to sustain this mitigation and prevention of harm through to September. But that is an example of what keeps all of us, not just myself, hard at work to prevent harm. And if you generalize it in those terms, we have many situations today where refugees are being refused admission. The example that I just mentioned earlier on is one of them. It's not the only one. In Cameroon, that country has accepted and is hosting a very large number of Nigerian refugees, but it is true. There are others who are being returned. That is one example. The other thing that keeps us hard at work and even loss of sleep is the integrity of what we do, the integrity of the services of the work that we provide. Because of resource constraints, we are having to program year in, year out, to program yearly programs for country operations that can sustain only 2 or 3 sectors from a potential of a total of about 19 to 21. We are obliged, because of resource constraints, to do constant revisions and reprioritization. I know you have indicated that is something you want to come to the end, so I won't go into that. But these things, what I want to highlight for now, in terms of the question that you have asked about what really keeps us preoccupied, is that the integrity of our programs as such, generally speaking, in many cases, are falling.
So indeed, we can come to the resource angle of that in a moment, but part of it is not resources. Part of it is internal organization. It's the way you partner with others. It's your own functioning as an organization. And one particular aspect that I think UNHCR itself has acknowledged being a weakness is the way in which it responds to IDPs. Or internally displaced people. And one of the questions is around UNHCR's mandate regarding IDPs, and that in reality often it isn't taking the lead, and here the suggestion is that IOM is often leading the IDP response on the ground. And in recognition of the fact that I think UNHCR hasn't been as predictable, as consistent, as coherent in its IDP responses, in 2016 you as UNHCR created a new team to review your responses to IDPs, and its report was released in September of last year, recommending that UNHCR needs to see itself as more automatically engaging in IDP crises the way it does with refugees, and that will require a number of changes in terms of how you staff, how you resource, how you budget, how you work with your partners. And as an example of that, we saw in the response to the Democratic Republic of Congo, a relatively small number of refugees in Angola was immediately prompted a UNHCR response, whereas a much larger number of IDPs within DRC took a lot longer to kind of activate. So what tangible progress have you made in operationalizing the recommendations of your own internal review of how you respond in IDP crises, which are increasingly of importance in many of the crises we see today? And then maybe you can also touch on the mandate issue.
Yes. Shall I begin with the mandate issue? Yeah. Now, if you ask lawyers this question about the mandate, they will probably say, legally speaking, we do not have a legal mandate for IDPs, or at least not one that equals the one that we have for refugees. My view is that we have a mandate, all of us together. What is a mandate? A mandate is a task with which you are visited. In the United Nations system, there are more than 5,000 mandates. So not only now, but already since 1972, we have been called upon to act on behalf of IDPs. And certainly we fully recognize that under the current arrangements, the IAC cluster arrangements, we clearly have a responsibility for the 3 clusters with which we are visited. So that is clear. That having been said, we also acknowledge, as you have said, that the response at large, including ours, could be much stronger. I think it is absolutely correct to say that today IDPs remain poor cousins of, if you compared them, for instance, to refugees. That is absolutely true. All those reforms that you have indicated are how we are trying to reset ourselves up in such a way as, and you have highlighted what this is all about, that we have more automatic, meaning much quicker engagement with IDP situations that mirror what happened in the case of Angola that you have mentioned when the refugees from the DRC went into Angola in April last year. So we are trying to get to that position. That our engagement is much more meaningful for the IDPs themselves. The overall response to IDPs, not only of UNHCR, but of the system as a whole, is still too heavily weighed down by processes, particularly coordination processes. So the idea, if I'm an IDP, it really doesn't matter to me how coordinated those who should respond to my situation are. What I'm interested in seeing is how does it touch me? And there's a big difference, I have to say, between what at least how we do it for refugees than what is the case for IDPs. So that is an important second part of it. If perhaps I can just mention one more, which is probably the most important of all, and that is to elevate the centrality of protection, to ensure that everything that we do across the board is governed by protection, and finally, that solutions also becomes a reflex of IDP response operations as it is for refugees. To be absolutely candid with you, we are still in the middle of setting up all these changes, and particularly in terms of the internal systems and capacities that will have to be created. The truth is that we are still in the stage of working those through. However, some of them have been trialed out, and you mentioned the DRC situation. Actually, to be fair to it, in that case, and I'm talking now of the IDP situation that occurred in the 2 Kasais, we have applied some of these measures that we are engineering to improve the predictability and effectiveness of our response. And just 2 very quick ones in that regard. Number 1 was to accelerate our engagement very, very quickly. My colleague who is overseeing this work in the House, I don't know if he's here, Mr. Steve Collis, he's at the back. He immediately went on mission there to help our office very, very quickly come to the point of engagement, number one. Number two, that protection would be key, not only in what we would do, but what everybody else will do. And then number three, which is a very difficult one, they have to be very honest, to perhaps have more equality of resources. That is to hopefully be able to apply as many of the resources needed for the IDP response as we do for the refugee response.
And by that you mean that there aren't actually staff that are dedicated to IDP responses?
That's one of it. The truth is that a lot of it is what you might call timeshare. But in terms of how we are dealing with that workforce part of things is to both skill up and professionalize the work around IDPs much more than is now, and hopefully to have more dedicated capacity than we presently do have.
I want to turn to, because I think the most popular question here relates to localization in the jargon, or more locally led responses. And that was one of the big priorities that emerged from the World Humanitarian Summit more than 2 years ago now. UNHCR committed, among other things, to directing 25% of its funding to local NGOs by 2020. But I think the room from this question, and you yourself recognize that it's not just about money, it's also about the way in which UNHCR engages with national NGOs. So before I get to the more technical question about overhead costs, what has UNHCR actually changed since the World Humanitarian Summit in the way it engages with national NGOs? And by that I mean, and local organizations more generally, giving them a greater decision-making role, reducing reporting requirements for national NGOs, changing some of the attitudes. And it also speaks, and we can get into that in a little bit more detail, to some of the questions around participation of refugees in some of the decision-making around programs and operations. What has actually changed since the World Humanitarian Summit?
Yes. All of the above. So that list of issues that you have gone through, and let me just echo them. One, the commitment that 25% of our funding would be channeled through national, local actors. The issue, and let me just emphasize this one because I want to claim, but please tell me if I'm telling a lie. I want to claim that in terms of engagement across the operational cycle, i.e. not just implementation, but everything from analysis to program design and construction to implementation, that we are doing that more as a partnership of equal stakeholders than a contractor, a contractee. That's at least my claim.
So what's an example of that in practice?
Yeah, it's the way the cycle actually operates, the way we actually do the analysis, the way we actually design programs together, which is much more joint. And quite frankly, if you allow me to be a little bit go into the jargon, we have something which is called the MYMP. That is the multi-year, multi-partner program system, program design system. It is the new system that we are applying now. So far, it is being trialed out in 21 or 22 operations. And this is the idea of changing away from designing a UNHCR program, to designing an all-of-partner plan, in which really there is equality of participation, and of course downstream of that, equality of implementation and resourcing, etc. So we have trialed that out in 21 operations. It is still early days. We are going in that direction. I want also to say that there is a commitment to reducing the burden of reporting. But what I can confirm here unequivocally is the commitment. And to admit that
but we know the commitment, George.
No, allow me to finish that.
What has actually happened?
I am being very honest about the fact that in terms of actual reduction of reporting, we are still on the way. And let me also be very candid that on particular point, the pressure is in the opposite direction. i.e. of increasing this volume of, and if you want, I can say one more one. Yes, yeah. It's in two very important areas: sexual exploitation and abuse, and fraud and corruption. Just let me say briefly that these are, and you heard the High Commissioner himself speak to this on Wednesday, these issues have risen even much more in the scale of importance in our operations. First, because they are serious in their own right, but also because they represent a threat to all of us. The irony, the sad irony, is that 800 asylum seekers can die on the high seas and life will go on. But today, an allegation, even before it is proved, of corruption, that, you know, a UNHCR staff member, a partner, etc., has stolen money, can bring our operationality to a halt. Because we have seen examples where just on the basis of a report alone, funding has stopped. So the pressures around this, to be very candid with you, both for us and for our partners, are increasing rather than diminishing reporting and account requirements for now.
So let's come back to the fraud and corruption in a moment. But yes, so let's stick with localization for the time being. And this question in particular highlighting the fact that we're all talking about the importance of national NGOs, and yet UNHCR's finance policy gives an admin or overhead cost in its partnerships to international NGOs, but not to national NGOs.
Yes. Do you mind if I just go to that question via this one? Yes. If you look at the profile of our engagement with NGO partners, generally speaking, and with particular reference to national partners, and I want to highlight emergency situations where the response is initially very, very heavy, you will find that our engagement with national partners tends to be in what I might call the softer areas of work, outreach, social and community work, etc. Whereas in the harder, more technical areas, WASH, etc., those types of things, we tend to rely on international NGOs. The reason I raise this issue is also to acknowledge, quite frankly, that our commitment to not only work with local partners, but to help, a lot of that work to concentrate on capacity building. Because as I said at the beginning, capacity is one of the greatest challenges that we face now. Is really very difficult, and in some places it's very tough to find a way to move. Why? Because as things stand now, we do not have a mechanism in which capacity building can be supported and funded in its own right, i.e. we will partner with either NGO X or a collectivity of NGOs coming together just to create capacity. And I'm not talking of things like training and so on. I'm talking of really creating capacity, which means, shall we contribute money for these organizations to build themselves up, to have staff, particularly to have staff in these technical areas that I've mentioned. The system is not set up like that. We have tried in the past, therefore, to say to our partners, especially the international NGOs, that let us create a box in the relationship that we have with you. So we have a strong implementation or even operational arrangement in any operation. Let us create a box in which you commit to have a local partner element built in there, which we will support. But you have to commit to carry it. I have to say that experiment has not been very successful. So this is all to say that when
why has it not been successful?
It has not, at least in the cases of which I was responsible as bureau director, and the NGOs that were involved in this are here, so I hope they will not mind my, without naming them, to say that there was, the word is not reluctance, but there was difficulty in accepting this arrangement. And it was all kinds of things. You know, if we bring staff in that are NGO staff, are they your staff? Are they our staff? What about supervision issues? What about, you know, there was a whole world of those types of issues. But really to say, and I'll just stop there here with that one, to say that we still have a gap in how to really do local capacity building in a real way, because the mechanisms for it do not exist. On the overhead costs issue, this I can be very quick about. The concept of the overhead is that you have an organization with which you have an operational partnership relation, an implementing partnership relationship in the field, but that organization at its headquarters in Norway, in Canada, whatever, is incurring program support costs in supporting those operations. So the concept is that we contribute towards that via a 7% of the value of the implementation relationship on the ground. So it works in a concept where you have an international NGO with an operation in a different location on the ground. When you're dealing with national NGO partners, because in the case of those national NGOs, the entire relationship is covered financially as part of the PPA. That's the jargon for this agreement that we have. Of course, the concept does not apply. The NGO partners say, and I agree with them, the NGO partners say, but that this facility is a very important one, because we need capacity to grow, and to grow in terms of our own skills and our own capacity to be able to support these operations that we do. In all the cases that I know of, I think there's been only one case where this 7% thing has been successful to essentially a nationally based NGO partners. But I have to say that it is because of normative issues on our organization in the way that I have described.
Very quickly, because we're running out of time, does anyone in the room have reactions to the two, I think, key points? One being George's assertion that there has been a shift towards a much more inclusive approach to program design and operation design. Is that your experience in reality? And the second, his experience in when UNHCR did try to encourage international NGOs to build the capacity of national NGOs. Those international NGOs were not willing. Any reactions from the floor to either of those? They raised concerns. They raised constraints. Yes.
Thank you. This is Salam from BRAC. I must thank Mr. High Commissioner to recent visit in Bangladesh, and especially the Rohingya camps in Cox's Bazar. And you rightly mentioned we are working in a complex coordination mechanism. And as you mentioned also, BRAC has that capacity to handle with the government, local management, and army also in the camps. I think you know all those things. And BRAC, with the partnership with UNHCR, and we currently handling the relocations in the camps. So with this effective partnership, we can able to manage and convince the government the urgent need for the Rohingyas. So the partnership is essential, and sometimes we also advocate for the Rohingyas and collaborate each other with UNHCR. For the capacity building, I think this is one area. The local NGO are not willing to accept this, not correct. They are willing, but sometimes they don't get chance to involve in the coordination mechanism is run by the INGOs. As there is a language barrier, and the human capacity also, so sometimes they don't involve. But from our side, we also manage some NGOs so that we can build their capacity. So I have one question to Commissioner, that the local capacity, national capacity build is one essential, and also UNHCR need build their capacity on local context. So what mechanism you will put in place to build joint capacity building? Thank you.
Before we answer that question, which, as I understand it, is what about capacitating UNHCR to be better able to respond in local context, I think there's a comment or question at the very back.
Sí. Hola, soy Marco Romero de Colombia. Gracias por esta sesión. Quisiera mencionar el tema de desplazamiento interno que ha estado circulando en la reunión.
Espera un momento para que ponen la traducción.
Bien.
Everyone's got their headsets on. Gracias.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Bien, el tema de desplazamiento forzado interno ha estado circulando en la sesión del día de hoy en varios momentos y quisiera dejar una preocupación. Estamos en momentos en que Naciones Unidas viene promoviendo los pactos mundiales sobre refugio y sobre migración, y esto es una buena noticia, está muy bien. Pero a veces vemos que el tema de desplazamiento, el tema de principios rectores, que es tan importante, está quedando por fuera de esa discusión y implica un riesgo de invisibilidad. En general, el tema de desplazamiento forzado siempre es una evidencia fuerte de la incapacidad de los estados para proteger a su propia población, y por eso es importante la protección internacional. Quisiera recomendar que el tema de principios rectores, que el tema de desplazamiento sea incluido de alguna forma en los pactos globales. Muchas gracias.
Yeah, I actually didn't catch that last question, but George, I think you got it. Okay. So I'll hand over to you for these two questions around national capacity and also capacity in the other direction.
So just to say that, of course, because I think the question was our own local capacity on the ground, and I think I have an idea of some of the things you have in mind, for instance, issues around language, issues around being able to communicate properly and so forth. Just to say, in the interest of time, that this is the reason why our own capacity or the ability for us to deal with certain things on the ground necessarily means developing stronger capacity of the local NGOs, including around issues of language, which in the context we're talking about is a very real one. But as I said, the commitment is not in question. How we actually do it step by step is what is the challenge. And then finally, if I've understood the comment or the question around the guiding principles, which is that the guiding principles should be incorporated in the global compact. I think you had the Assistant High Commissioner for Protection confirm yesterday here that the Global Compact, in fact, has a reference to the IDP question. And my colleague Steve, I think in a later session, I think will talk about the guiding principles themselves and how we're going to move forward on that. So I'll leave that to that session.
So we'll try to wrap up now, but maybe with one final kind of thematic area. And I'm sorry we haven't gotten to everything, but I think we have covered a bit of ground. And that is the question of participation. And when we talk about putting people first, I think there are a number of questions from Pigeonhole around inclusion of different groups, whether it's young people being more involved in UNHCR's technology solutions, for example, to the Global Refugee Summit, which was held this week, which was really meant to bring together refugees so that they can mobilize themselves and speak in their own voices, and the extent to which they are included in the kind of program design and all of these decisions that are being made about them. There are questions around women's involvement and gender participation. And so overall, I'd love to hear, again, very concretely, what UNHCR has done recently in making its entire cycle, as you called it, the whole program cycle, more inclusive of the people it is actually meant to be serving. And if you could give us a great, practical, concrete example of that on the ground.
Yes. First, I said at the beginning that if there's one thing I would really like us to retain from this overall discussion, it is capacity. I think the second one has to be engagement of all the people with whom we work. But let me talk particularly about the youth. By far the most important thing, if I had to single out one, is to secure the safety and integrity of education and learning programs for young people across the board, and also to follow that through and help the young people that have gone through empowerment through education actually to be able to live a life in which they earn income and can take care of themselves. If I correlate this then with the CRRF, which helps us particularly to secure that, in all the examples of where the CRF is being rolled out, or also where we're working with the World Bank on this IDA 18 that you had explained in the earlier sessions, particularly by Danielle, education is at the top of what we try to secure in all the refugee responses that we have through these development programs. In terms of just how we work on the ground, I think that will be case by case. I think there are operations in which engagement of whether women, whether young people, whether people with disability, etc., is very successful. But I also have to be very honest that there are others where, for a number of reasons that we do not have the time to go into, we are much further behind. We still have operations today where, for instance, women participation is very difficult. We still have operations today where you find a refugee leadership group that is made up not only of men, but very old men, actually. There's nothing wrong with very old men. I am one of them. But most of our refugee situations are characteristic of young people. So younger people. So it varies from time to time. What is common across the board is our commitment more and more day in, day out to work towards this greater inclusivity. And not only consulting with, not only talking with, not only listening to refugees, whether they're young people, whether they're people with disability, women, etc., but to engage them in the decisions that we make that ultimately impact their life.
If I can just end on perhaps a provocative note, which is, you know, you just put it as engaging them in the decisions that we make. I would suggest that in 2018, for many of the reasons that you've already described around resource constraints and so on, this traditional model of an international system parachuting into a crisis to save the people on the ground, and that we're still having a conversation around how then do we engage those people in those international systems rather than really flipping that switch and saying, okay, first of all, we can't afford to be present and engaging everywhere. And second of all, it's not the most effective way to provide assistance and protection at this day and age, given all of the discussions around neocolonialism and racism and some of the things we've seen around exploitation and abuse. I mean, do you feel that the way the operational structure of UNHCR is currently set up is still relevant today?
Yeah. I think the issue of an engagement is not a UNHCR specific one. Whoever would be the agent of that accountability, whether it is governments, whether it is NGOs, local ones as well, engagement is true in those cases. We have an accountability, and that's why we are on the ground. And as long as we are there and have to speak to this accountability and be able to affirm that we have delivered in it, what I am confirming, and I hope there is, if there was, or if still exists, that paternalism and so on, that of course that's absolutely the wrong way to do it, that we do it much, much more. But as I said, that the people themselves defining what it is that they want, and the best way to address it. And I actually omitted to mention that in answering your question earlier on about cash, for instance.
Well, we didn't even get to cash.
We didn't even get to that, which is that, I mean, we debate about cash and so on among ourselves, about this, that, who will do that, and so forth. But the refugees themselves are very clear. I do not want your plastic sheetings and so on. Just let me have the ability to be able to make that decision for myself. And again, as I say, I am hoping that more and more we are demonstrating this in reality on the ground. Again, I know of examples where we're doing it relatively well, but others where that journey still has to be made.
I'm sorry to stretch this on, but one last point, because it's just a pet peeve of ours at IRIN on cash, which is that cash was meant to, as you just said, put people first, give them the choice of how they want to spend the money, what they want to do with it, and really flip the way in which we perceive of aid. And yet, when cash has actually been rolled out operationally, we've seen that it gets caught up in this very competitive landscape between UN agencies fighting over who's going to control the cash programs. And we saw that between UNHCR and WFP in many occasions, in Turkey, in Lebanon, and so on, where, in fact, it isn't about the people receiving the cash, but it's about the organizational interests. How is this possible? I don't really know how to put it in any more of a sophisticated way, but how is it possible that organizational interests come before the people that you're trying to help?
Yes. The answer is yes and no. I.e., in those particular cases, and Turkey was one, in the Middle East, in Lebanon is the other, there could be one or two other examples, where there has been interagency strife, let's put it like that, between UNHCR and WFP around things which at this particular stage in the evolution of the application of cash in humanitarian refugee programs, these issues around, is it one agency or only, or is it a single agency? Is it a more inclusive approach, which is what we have fronted as an organization, including NGO partners. We have a very successful model in Lebanon for that. In those operations, those things have occurred. But let us not overgeneralize, because since 2016 to the end of last year, UNHCR has disbursed as cash $1.2 billion in 95 country operations. This strife, if that's what it is not the character at all in the majority of those operations. And what we are increasingly working at is the straight line approach, quite frankly, the straightest approach between delivery systems and the refugees themselves in getting cash to them. In the cases where we still have this competition, as it is described, I can only say that right now, and this is at head of agency level, it's not even at line level, especially between us and WFP, we are hoping that we can resolve these questions as quickly as possible so that the general pattern will be one of focusing by far the most of all on the people themselves.
I want to thank George for being willing to take these questions and being open and transparent. I want to thank you guys for your questions and inputs. Apologies for running a bit late, and wish you all the best with the rest of your day. Good luck.
Thank you.